When I started this project almost 3 years ago, I, like so many researchers before me, got pulled into the same old quotes and statistics surrounding the history of vaccines and of vaccination. And while these are important factors to consider regarding the vaccine industry, the true nature of the term vaccination is now completely and utterly foreign to what my previous misconception of that word was. Before we can begin to comprehend just what the word vaccination really means, we must first break down into simple terms what the purpose of a vaccine is. A vaccine has three basic functions, listed here in their most simple terms. A vaccine is designed to transport. A vaccine is designed to create. And a vaccine is designed to destroy or to suppress. As a transportation vehicle, a vaccine is designed to directly bypass the body's mucous membrane and other protective natural barriers in order to deliver some specific thing into the muscle and bloodstream of the living body, where that thing can then accomplish its specific goal. It's sort of like a taxicab dropping off its fare. But with vaccines, each taxicab has hundreds of passengers and billions of foreign particles. Most people, including myself, have always believed that the goal of these injections was to specifically and altruistically create a healthy immune response to the ingredients that are delivered by the vaccine, helping to prevent future viral attacks. But as it turns out, this is not quite the case. For we must remember that vaccination is also designed to destroy, either through the killing of a pathogen or virus, or through the suppression of a specific bodily function. Generally, the popular desired response of a vaccine is the creation and production of what are called antibodies. In fact, medical standards and practices define an effective vaccine as creating an antibody response. Note that the words cure, heal, and immunity are not included in the description of vaccination, for that is not the goal of this suppressive medicine. The only specifically stated medical goal is the creation of antibodies. That's it, nothing more. But have you ever actually thought about what that word really means? When we break it down into its two parts, we find that the word antibody can simply be translated to a destroyer of life, or anti-life. If your sole function in life as an antibody is to suppress or to kill something that is living, then your sole purpose in life is to harm or kill life itself. When a vaccine creates an antibody response by stimulating the body's immune system, the function of that particular body, be it a virus, a pathogen, a cancer, or a whole specific system of the body like the neuromuscular or reproductive system, through vaccination or antibody response is either suppressed, mutated, or stopped altogether. The effects of vaccination can be either temporary or permanent, depending on the intention of the manufacturer and of the many hundreds of ingredients found within. We've all heard of the traditional flu vaccine, and many, if not most of us, have received the recommended childhood vaccinations like polio, measles, mumps, and rubella, and a whole plethora of immunizations. But before we can understand the full potential of vaccination, we must also understand the way in which a vaccine can work by non-traditional means. In other words, in a way that you probably could never have imagined. Remember, transportation, creation, suppression, and death. Now, perhaps you've heard some offhanded conspiracy theory, some ridiculous notion out there that the ruthless and cunning wealthy elite are planning on using vaccinations to control the populations of Earth, and even to reduce that population by up to 90%. Well, as it turns out, that is exactly what the United States Geological Survey has been doing for over 23 years. When we go to the website for the United States Geological Survey, we come across this page, which is based at the Fort Collins Science Center. It just so happens that in the 1970s and 80s, the wild horse population of the northern United States was getting a bit out of hand. Largely unchecked by natural predators, many wild horse populations grow at rates of 18 to 25% per year. This unregulated growth can overtax vegetation and affect herd health, as well as native wildlife populations. The Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 requires the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, and USDA Forest Service to manage these free-roaming herds for a thriving natural ecological balance. To ensure the sustainability and health of both horse herds and the public lands they roam, and to reduce the number of animals requiring either adoption or long-term care in holding areas, managers began to explore fertility control as an alternative management technique. From 1978 to the 1980s, the Bureau of Land Management worked through a series of research contracts focusing primarily on development of a chemosterilant for the wild stallions. In the early 1990s, research then turned to silicone implants in mares in an effort to achieve fertility control. Although both routes indeed produced fertility control, they had too many drawbacks and were eventually abandoned. Finally, a National Park Service research team on Assateague Island National Seashore turned to an immunocontraceptive agent called porcine zona pellucida, or PZP, which had already been reported to block fertilization in dogs, rabbits, and primates. Experimental PZP application on the wild horses of Assateague Island commenced in 1988, resulting in promising reductions in the pregnancy rates of mares, and by 1994, population growth began to stabilize solely through the use of PZP immunocontraception. Porcine zona pellucida has been successfully applied to control fertility and limit the size of several small populations of wild horses on eastern barrier islands since the early 1990s. Population-level field trials of an injectable time-release pellet form of PZP that will allow almost 2 years of fertility control with a single treatment are currently underway in many western herds. U.S. Geological Survey researchers are investigating the potential behavioral impacts of fertility control treatments, as well as population dynamics and demographics in these herds. In addition, the three agencies are cooperating on population-level studies of the efficacy of PZP in several western horse herds. In these studies, population growth rate is the response variable. Now, I'm sure that you're curious how this porcine zona pellucida, or PZP, actually works. Under the How PZP Works section, it states, in order for sperm to attach to the ovum and fertilize the egg, there must be complementary proteins on both the surface of the sperm and the zona pellucida, or ZP, of the ovum. PZP acts as a foreign protein against which the treated mare produces antibodies. Thus, the PZP fertility control agent is actually a vaccine. Again, this fertility control agent is actually a vaccine, which creates an antibody and destroys the protein structure of the reproductive organs and sperm. These antibodies attach to the mare's zona sperm receptors on the ovum and block fertilization. Domestic pig ovaries, obtained from slaughterhouses, are minced, and the PZP is obtained from screening filtration. An adjuvant is mixed with the PZP to enhance its effectiveness when it is injected into the mares intramuscularly. Once injected, it causes an immune response, making the mare infertile. Over time, the antibody titers fall and fertility returns. With the liquid vaccine, a booster injection can be given at 10 months to raise the titers back to the infertile range. This can be done each year for at least 4 years, after which time the effects may be more likely to become permanent. For this reason, current individual-level field trials involve only 1 to 4 years of treatment. Now that you understand that the concept and definition of vaccination goes way beyond just a viral or disease immunization process, and in fact can be specifically designed and genetically altered to create the desired suppression and sterilization of its injected host, and for that matter the breakdown of most individual or group bodily functions, many of these crazy things that you might be hearing around the way shouldn't sound quite so crazy anymore. And, just out of curiosity, what would happen if you replaced the word horse with the word human? Well, I was curious about this myself, and I wondered if indeed there were human versions of this sterilization vaccination process. And what I found was astounding. Hundreds and hundreds of U.S. government patents reared their ugly heads, declaring drugs, vaccines, and methods to halt reproductive function in all life forms, but especially in humans and animals. Perhaps the most frighteningly comparable of these patents to what the USGS has accomplished in the horse population is this one, published March 10th, 2011. It is entitled Lonidamine Analogs for Fertility Management. It states that fertility management can include administering to the subject 1 or more doses of a compound according to Formula 1 so as to reduce fertility in the subject. Fertility management can also include administering an effective amount of the compound to impair Sertoli cell function in a male subject, inhibit spermatogenesis in the subject, reduce testes weight in the subject, reduce ovary weight in a female subject, reduce serum progesterone in the female subject, and impair ovarian follicle function in the female subject, causing reversible fertility in the subject. This sounds familiar. In order to return fertility, the method can include ceasing administration of the compound to the subject so as to return fertility in the subject. The compound can also be administered for irreversibly sterilizing the subject. But in this case, the subject is a man or woman. Under paragraph 1, it states that the present patent application is a continuation in part of these U.S. patents, and claims benefit to other U.S. provisional applications, for which the applications of those patents are incorporated herein by specific reference in their entirety by specific reference. Paragraph 2 then states that this invention was made with government support, awarded by the National Institutes of Health. The government has certain rights in the invention. In other words, it will profit from this invention. The present invention relates to novel or unique analogs of lonidamine. In particular, some of these novel analogs are useful in sterilizing males and females and inhibiting reproduction potential. Under background of the invention, and paragraph 4, it states, the prevention of unplanned pregnancy in humans and other mammals is of continuing concern for both the developing and the developed world. A variety of methods and products have been proposed or developed for the prevention of pregnancy. These products include surgical sterilization, condoms, birth control pills containing progesterone or a combination of progesterone and estrogen, subdermal implants containing delayed-release forms of progesterone, intrauterine devices, spermicidal creams or gels, and intravaginal barriers such as sponges or diaphragms. Male contraceptive approaches have included the barrier methods, hormonal methods, the rhythm method, and immunological methods. More recently, researchers have begun investigating compounds which inhibit spermatogenesis by disrupting junctional complex sites between Sertoli cells and germ cells in the testes. One such compound is lonidamine, which belongs to a group of indazole carboxylic acid compounds that was found to be a potent inhibitor of spermatogenesis. However, the anti-spermatogenic effects of lonidamine at high doses were found to be irreversible and toxic. Paragraph 6 states that several analogs of lonidamine have recently been investigated as spermatogenic inhibitors. Under the brief summary of the invention section, it states that the present invention is directed to novel or unique compounds which are useful for managing fertility, such as reducing fertility in a subject for a period of time and then restoring fertility. Such a fertility management can include administering to the subject one or more doses of a compound according to Formula 1, so as to reduce fertility in the subject. Paragraph 14 states, fertility management can also include administering an effective amount of the compound to impair Sertoli cell function in a male subject. For example, the compound can be administered in an effective amount to inhibit spermatogenesis in the subject. Also, the compound can be administered in an effective amount to reduce testes weight in the subject. Fertility management can also include administering an effective amount of the compound to reduce ovary weight in the female subject. The compound can also be administered in a therapeutically effective amount to reduce serum progesterone in the female subject, to impair ovarian follicle function in the female subject, and for causing reversible fertility in the subject. In order to return fertility, the method can include ceasing administration of the compound to the subject so as to return fertility in the subject. In another embodiment, the compound can be administered in an effective amount for irreversibly sterilizing the subject. This can include one or more doses to impart sterility. And the fertility management can include inhibiting spermatogenesis in a male subject, administering to the male subject a compound according to Formula 1 so as to inhibit spermatogenesis where Formula 1 is described herein. It goes on to state that higher dosing amounts can permanently impair the Sertoli cell function in a male subject. Lower doses can provide reversible infertility, where ceasing administration of the compound to the subject can return spermatogenesis potential in the subject. And in yet another embodiment, the compounds can be used in fertility management for women. The compounds can be administered alone or in combination of another fertility-managing compound. Formula 1 can be administered to a female subject so as to reduce fertility. And in the modulating fertility section, it states that the compounds described herein can be used in managing male and female fertility. The compounds can be administered in one or more doses to inhibit fertility for a period of time or to sterilize the male or female. GMZ, which is a novel or unique indazole carboxylic acid derivative, has been shown to be a reversible inhibitor of male spermatogenesis. It was found that 100% infertility was achieved in 7 out of 7 proven fertile male rats 3 weeks following a single oral dose of 6 milligrams of GMZ. Fertility returned by 9 weeks in only 4 of the 7 animals. 100% fertility returned in 4 of the 6 animals that became infertile at a single oral dose of 3 milligrams. The multiple low-dose option is also attractive in that it is conceivable that a once-a-week or once-a-month oral male contraceptive pill could selectively block the spermatid stage of spermatogenesis, also allowing for eventual repopulation of testes after terminating compound administration. Paragraph 259 states, "The patient to be treated with the compounds of the present invention can be any animal, and is preferably a mammal, such as a wild or domesticated animal, like cats or dogs, or a livestock animal, like horses, cows, pigs, sheep, or humans." Well, now, wait a minute. Why would this patent refer to a human as a mammal, or in this case, an animal? When we visit the U.S. Code of the United States government, under Title VII, which is Agriculture, and we go to Chapter 6, Insecticides and Environmental Pesticide Control, under Chapter 2, subsection 136, we come to the Definitions section, where the government defines, under paragraph D, the term animal. It states here that the term animal means all vertebrate and invertebrate species, including but not limited to man, and other mammals, birds, fish, and shellfish. So the government actually defines man as an animal when talking about pest control. But wait a minute, I thought a man was a person. But wait a minute, under paragraph S it states that a person, or the term person, means any individual, partnership, association, corporation, or any organized group of persons, whether incorporated or not. So, a man is not necessarily a person, according to government legal code. Just below that, under paragraph T, the government defines what a pest is. Any insect, rodent, nematode, fungus, weed, or 2. Any other form of terrestrial or aquatic plant or animal life, or virus, bacteria, or other microorganism, except viruses, bacteria, or other microorganisms on or in living man or other living animals, which the administrator declares to be a pest. A pest being an animal, and an animal being a man. And so we understand that by looking into U.S. Code, human-animal management, the management of the people of the earth, are no different than the management of the livestock, insect, and other life forms on the earth. We are, according to U.S. Code, no different than cattle, or, for our purposes, wild horses. I guess the only question I have about paragraph 259 here is whether I'm a wild or domesticated human. Now, there are many groups out there who advocate population control. One of those is called the Population Council. Here it states that Adjudin is a new drug and an analog of an old drug known as lonidamine. Lonidamine is an anti-cancer medication whose contraceptive effect was discovered in the 1980s. Researchers did not pursue lonidamine, well, we know that's not true, as a male contraceptive because at high doses it caused kidney damage. Since then, a group of scientists at New York's Population Council, a non-profit contraceptive research organization, have sought compounds less toxic than, but functionally similar to, lonidamine. Advances in screening technology led to the identification of several promising non-toxic compounds in the late 1990s. One of these compounds, AF-2364 or Adjudin, is moving towards trials in humans. Now, which humans they're getting to test a sterility vaccine, I'm not sure. How does it work? Adjudin provides contraception by disrupting the process of sperm maturation in the testes. It changes the way Sertoli cells, which divide to produce new sperm cells and then nurse the immature sperm, interact with sperm. In normal sperm production, Sertoli cells remain connected with immature sperm through a series of microscopic bridges and channels. These bridges provide materials and information needed to direct the development of the immature sperm, or spermatids. Spermatids must undergo a series of cellular changes in order to become functional sperm. These changes include packing down the sperm's DNA, shaping the cell for fast swimming, and preparing the cell's membrane to recognize and fuse with an egg. When rats were treated with Agidin, the bridges between Sertoli cells and spermatids broke before the maturation processes were complete. The prematurely released sperm are molecularly incomplete and never become capable of fertilizing an egg. So how is this miracle sterilization drug delivered? Effective delivery has been one of Agidin's major development hurdles. The compound has extremely low bioavailability, with less than 0.035% of an oral dose reaching the targeted tissues. While grinding the compound extremely fine, or micronization, improved oral uptake slightly, injecting or vaccinating the compound into muscle tissue did not. So, fortunately for us, researchers at the Population Council devised a new delivery mechanism which takes advantage of the body's own delivery system. Researchers attached Agidin to a slightly modified hormone, a follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. The modified FSH is shaped differently enough that it no longer functions as a hormone, but receptors still recognize and bind to it. And here's the hook. The only cells in men that recognize and bind to FSH are Sertoli cells in the testes, the exact target for Agidin. Thanks to this targeted delivery, an injection, or again, a vaccination of the modified FSH with Agidin attached is many times more effective than pure Agidin taken orally. Only a very small dose is needed to sterilize humans. Now, as we look through all of these government patents, we find different classes of fertility control in different types and classes of animals, insects, and other life forms. But I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised by these revelations or the fact that our representative government is allowing these sterility vaccines and products to be produced and used all around the world on both animals and humans. Not that the government thinks there's any difference between the two. But let's shift gears here and talk about the now infamous outbreak of the so-called 2009 swine flu. When we actually look at the vaccine insert for the Novartis swine flu vaccine, we find some interesting facts. Under the Use in Specific Populations section, it states that safety and effectiveness of influenza A, or H1N1, 2009 monovalent vaccine have not been established in pregnant women, nursing mothers, or children less than 4 years of age. Under Section 8.1 in pregnancy, it states that animal reproduction studies have not been conducted with influenza A or H1N1 vaccine or fluvirin. It is also not known whether influenza A, H1N1 vaccine, or fluvirin can cause fetal harm when administered to a pregnant woman or can affect reproduction capacity. The influenza A Novartis vaccine should be given to a pregnant woman only if clearly needed. Now, how one determines how a pregnant woman could clearly need a vaccine is beyond my comprehension. Under Section 13.1, titled Carcinogenesis, Mutagenesis, and Impairment of Fertility, it states that neither fluvirin nor the influenza A H1N1 2009 monovalent vaccine have been evaluated for carcinogenic or mutagenic potential, or for impairment of fertility. Note here for future reference that the term carcinogenesis refers to the development of cancer, and that development means growth. The World English Dictionary defines carcinogenesis as the development of cancerous cells from normal cells. and so the carcinogenic or cancer-causing effects of this vaccine have not been evaluated. This will become a very important part of the puzzle later on in this presentation. And this paragraph allows Novartis to be off the hook as a government-contracted corporation for causing any harm to the human or animal population. And under adverse reaction, it reads, adverse reaction information is based on studies conducted with the seasonal trivalent influenza virus vaccine manufactured by Novartis called Fluvirin. The most frequently reported adverse reactions are mild hypersensitivity reactions, such as a rash, local reactions at the injection site, and influenza-like symptoms. In other words, by receiving the flu vaccine, some people catch the flu.
The Rockefeller Foundation, having worked with the UN Development Program, the World Bank, and the WHO to develop an abortifacient vaccine that laced tetanus toxoids with human gonadotrophin hormone, causing pregnant women who took the vaccine to spontaneously abort. The vaccines were given to women in Thailand, the Philippines, Nicaragua, Mexico, and Africa, with women only finding out what had been done to them when independent organizations had paid out of their own pockets to test the vaccines and discovered the HCG hormones. Now, a newer generation of billionaires are practicing using their wealth toward continuing the work of the older billionaire eugenicists.
This equation has four factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero, and that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
The original Rockefeller-hosted Super Friends dinner that gave rise to the Billionaire Pledge concluded that the most pressing issue facing the world is reducing the population.
Now, there are many, many smoking guns when it comes to the vaccine industry and the government-protected criminal activity that it is involved in. But perhaps the most telling of these is just how the so-called 2009 swine flu and the 2005 bird flu came about in the first place.
My name is A. Truott. I have a PhD doctorate in the field of nutrition. I'm also a licensed naturopathic doctor, and we'll just, topic of discussion will be, are the new vaccine lines, specifically the so-called H1N1 vaccines, is safe? What's the rationale and basis behind it? First of all, you have to understand what happens in biological warfare laboratories. In Fort Detrick, there in Gaithersburg, Maryland, there's a weapons laboratory that's tied to the National Institutes of Health and the CDC, but it's military-based. It's at Fort Detrick. It's a biological weapons research laboratory. Top secret and have high clearance. But in the year 1997, new technology came on board that could map the complex genome structures of everything. The Genome Map project basically is a massive supercomputer, a new technology, a new technological breakthrough that could allow the construction of DNA and resampling of all human DNA and animal DNA. Nothing was secret anymore. So when this computer system went online, this empowered the people at Fort Detrick to be able to create a new breed of virus, a weaponized virus. So this new supercomputer structure allows the scientists now at Fort Detrick to be God in the laboratory and make viruses and, out of really thin air, basically, okay? Given the protein structures, given all this. But so if you look back at history, one of the biggest killer viruses to hit the planet occurred in the year 1918. It was the so-called 1918 flu virus. And some reports killed 50 million people worldwide. That to these weaponized engineers, these sick scientists, they wanted to recreate the 1918 virus. But to do that, they had to get a sample of the virus.
Molecular pathology is a specialty of medicine where pathologists use the tools of molecular biology and molecular genetics to make diagnoses and provide insight into patient care decisions. You can make diagnoses of infectious diseases by looking for the genetic material of the infectious organism, the virus or the bacteria, for example. I was in the National Cancer Institute as a pathologist in the 80s, and in 1993 I moved to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology to set up a new group devoted to molecular pathology, both for clinical molecular pathology as well as research. And one of the things we had to do for both sides of that was to work out ways to recover genetic material from typical biopsy material. The tissue repository at the A5P goes back to the Civil War, so they have a huge collection of millions of tissue samples reflecting all aspects of clinical disease, tumors and infectious disease, including autopsies of soldiers who died of flu in 1918. I wanted to think of a project that would highlight the utility of having such an old tissue archive as well as our new molecular techniques in which we could do analyses. And the way those two things came together in my mind was to go after the 1918 flu. We thought that it might be possible to recover fragments of the genetic material of the virus still preserved in autopsy tissues of people who died in 1918. We had started this project in 1995, and it took over a year to find a first positive case, to work out our techniques to make sure that we actually could find influenza. Once we had found a first positive case and we started to generate sequence and compare it to known influenza viruses, we were convinced that we had really found the 1918 virus. But we were really concerned that there would be inadequate amounts of material available to us to sequence the whole virus from that material.
In March of 1997, in Science News, there it was, 1918 pandemic virus found. A small sequence had been discovered by Jeffrey Tollenberger. I wrote a letter saying, if you need more specimens, let me know and I will go back to Alaska. I've been there before, I know where it is, I can go back.
We were extremely excited about the possibility. We had hoped that if we could recover material from a frozen victim, that the quality of genetic material of the virus might be improved over what we had in these formalin-fixed blocks.
Dr. Holton presented his case to the Brevik Village Council, including Rita Olana. He made sure they understood that the virus was dead and could not cause disease.
I knew where the grave was, so I marked it off. At the end of the first day, we were down to about 4 feet, and I didn't see anything at all, and 5 feet. And the following day, I noticed that there's some bodies at 7 feet. Found a skeleton, and then next to the skeleton was a woman. and perfectly preserved. The clothing had fallen off, rotted away, but I could see the skin, and it was of an obese woman. I got it to do the postmortem, and then I took the rib cage off, and there exposed their lungs. And they were the textbook picture of a person who had died from acute viral pneumonitis. Exactly what I needed. The subcutaneous fatty layer, Lucy, and fat inside, of course, also, that had protected the lungs from the occasional thaws of the permafrost that had reached 7 feet down. And about an hour later, the bush pilot landed, and I got all of my specimens on board, and then I shipped them to Jeffrey Taubenberger.
The advantage that we had was that the formalin-fixed autopsy tissue samples were extremely tiny, just the size of a fingernail, and so were very limiting, where he was able to provide us large sections of an entire lung, so that even though the quality of RNA was lower, we had so much more material to work with, it became absolutely clear that we would be able to sequence the rest of the virus from that material.
And I figured it would take weeks and weeks before he had any inkling of that the specimens were good. Like 10 days later, he called and he said, "Joel, we have it. Specimen is good. And we have lots of specimen. Great material, and this is going to be wonderful." It was a great day.
The effort to sequence the entire genome of the 1918 virus from beginning to end took 10 years. It was a very laborious process.
More than 13,000 pieces of genetic information that had to be put together as a total.
It's clearly a virus that was human adapted, but genetically it's very bird-like in its sequence. It's very avian-like. And so what we think is that it is an entirely avian-like influenza virus that somehow adapted to humans. We now know that there are a number of mutations in several of the genes that are absolutely crucial in the adaptation to humans. The 1918 flu had as its most unique feature the fact that it had a high propensity to kill young adults ages 15 to 40.
Another question about the death toll in the 1918 flu pandemic was how people died after they became ill with the flu. Dr. Taubenberger and Dr. Morens examined not only the autopsy tissues in the AFIP collection, but also autopsy reports from all over the world of people who had died of pandemic influenza.
We find that the vast majority of people dying died because of secondary bacterial pneumonia. What we think happened is that a very virulent influenza virus caused such an extensive inflammatory response in the lungs and caused such tissue damage that bacteria like strep or pneumococcus that are very commonly carried in the throat of normal individuals could spread down into the lung and cause a disease that would ultimately actually kill the person. The evidence of the bacterial pneumonias, I think, helps explain why you had such high mortality in military camps, particularly. While this is very important in trying to understand what happened in 1918, it also has significant implications for pandemic planning in the future.
We've really seen an explosion in information about influenza in the last 10 or so years because primarily, I think, of sequencing of the 1918 virus, but also the unusual events associated with the H5N1 virus, the bird flu virus.
In order for this avian influenza virus to cause a pandemic, we would have to see a number of changes that would occur in the virus so that the virus could be transmitted easily from human to human to human.
I think the biggest lesson is that we can't predict what influenza will do. In villages in Alaska, for example, the whole village would become sick at once. There'd be nobody to provide food, nobody to provide shelter. These things can make a difference. And even in wealthy nations like the United States, the conclusion at the end of 1918 and 1919 was that the single most important thing that could save your life from flu was good nursing care. Not medicines, not doctors, not hospitals, but good nursing care. When you first read those things, you're likely to say, oh, that can't be true. What could they do in those days? You know, what's chicken soup going to do? What's a blanket going to do? I believe the data. They're strong, and some of the best and smartest physicians, nurses, and other observers said it again and again. Good nursing care.
When we started the project, there were really two fundamental questions that we wanted to answer. That is, one, why was this virus so particularly virulent? Why did it kill so many people, especially young, healthy adults? And secondly, where did this virus come from? We were hoping to learn from what we see in 1918 to apply it to the future, that we could understand how pandemics form and why particular flu viruses cause more disease than others.
Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to weaponize something that was such a killer and killed so many innocent people? And more importantly, I was always wondering how this happened. How did this 1918 thing happen? And in my research, I came across a book that was published in 1920 entitled The Horrors of Vaccination. It was a research man named Charles Higgins in New York, had done his own research project for 2 years and put together this book, and he presented the first copy off the press to Woodrow Wilson. The whole intent was to stop the mandatory vaccination of our military troops. What he shows in this book is a documented structure that the 1918 virus came out of the mass vaccination of our troops in World War I.
Many cases originally diagnosed as influenza in the American Expeditionary Forces have subsequently proven to be typhoid. Intestinal types of supposed influenza should always be considered as possible typhoid until proven otherwise. The frequency with which atypical, mild, unrecognized cases of typhoid and paratyphoid fever has occurred in the American Expeditionary Forces among vaccinated men makes it absolutely essential to surround all such cases of undetermined fever with the same precautions which it is found necessary to apply to established typhoid or paratyphoid patients, to avoid contact infections in the wards among other patients and hospital personnel. And finally, at the end of his presentation, Charles M. Higgins presented the following conclusion to the President of the United States, where he stated, "As soon, therefore, as this crushing fact of the great danger of vaccination to human health and life enters the mind and conscience of the mass of the people, and is fully grasped by the legislative, the judicial, and the executive minds of the country, from whom it has been so long concealed by medical falsehood in high places, this enlightenment will, I firmly believe, result in the permanent abolishment of all compulsory vaccination, if not in the penal prohibition of general vaccination, as being now more dangerous than natural smallpox. And to that great fact, and to this final and prophetic thought, Mr. President, I ask your careful attention in closing this exposure of vaccination horrors and medical mendacities. Respectfully submitted on this U.S. Constitution Day, September 17th, 1919.
So once he had all this analyzed, the question become like Charles Higgins back in 1920. How did this killer virus come to be? Well, we find out that every Allied as well as German troop were given a vaccine manufactured by the Rockefeller laboratories, a vaccine protecting against typhus fever. Now you look at how the typhus fever vaccine worked. They harvested the human typhus fever virus. They thought it was a bacteria back then, but now we know it's a viral structure, from humans that were infected with typhus fever blisters, harvested the material, injected it into pigs as a carrier, and made the pigs compound and multiply the virus. Then they harvested it from the pigs and put it into chickens as the medium for growth. So there you have the meshing of a direct bodily injection of these viruses and the RNA started to mingle, and then you have this killer virus that's coming out. This typhus fever vaccine was then given to millions and millions of people worldwide. The Russians got injections, the Germans got it first, before the Allied troops did, but then the U.S. troops, the British troops, all of these that received the vaccine, a goodly percentage of them came down with what they classified as a mystery pneumonia. They called it a paratyphus pneumonia because it was, you had the typhus fever type of symptoms of diarrhea, vomiting, and then it settled into your lungs, and before long you died of what's called a cytokine storm, where your lungs filled up with fluid. You basically die in your own blood. That's how you die. Now, it wasn't until many, many years later they called it influenza of 1918. But all the medical journals, according to Higgins, it was called paratyphus pneumonia that was this mystery killer. But Higgins tied it into the vaccines very, very well, and this book was presented to President Woodrow Wilson. So there we have the understanding of how this killer virus came about in the first place.
Let us now proceed with the rest of the vaccine story, keeping in mind that this patented evidence is available for anyone to see on the government's U.S. Patent Search website. With that in mind, let's examine the history of vaccines. When considering the health benefits of vaccines and whether or not they historically cure disease or prevent infection, one only need look at the historic data, which shows that vaccines were historically introduced only after group immunity was well established and sanitary conditions were universally improved. These graphs are based on the official death numbers as recorded in the official yearbooks of the Commonwealth of Australia, from Greg Beattie's book, Vaccination, A Parent's Dilemma, and represent the decline in death rates from infectious disease in Australia. They clearly show that vaccines had nothing to do with the decline in death rates. Note here that the graphical evidence on the decline in death rates from infectious disease for the United States, England, New Zealand, and many other countries shows the exact same scenario. For instance, the figure below shows that the death rate attributed to measles in Massachusetts for the 110 years between 1860 and 1970 had dropped long before the measles vaccine was introduced in 1963, and even spiked a bit after the vaccine was introduced, according to government data. So what were the true reasons for this decline? From his book, Health and Healing, Dr. Andrew Weil best answers this question with this statement. Scientific medicine has taken credit it does not deserve for some advances in health. Most people believe that victory over the infectious diseases of the last century came with the invention of immunizations. In fact, cholera, typhoid, tetanus, diphtheria, and whooping cough, etc., were in decline before vaccines for them became available, the result of better methods of sanitation, sewage disposal, and distribution of food and water.
Look at this. They had so much aluminum, they decided that they had to put it on the American people. And so, here's what they've done. I have a book here that I would like, it's out of print. It's called Murder by Injection. They just give you vaccinations. In 1961, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad told us, don't take the polio vaccine. And we obeyed him. And later we found out that the vaccine was contaminated with something called SV40, which was a cancer that they were injecting the children with. Well, you don't see it in your youth, but you just keep living life, and all of a sudden you begin to break down. When your grandfather was here, they didn't have no cancer thing. They eating from the ground. He wasn't dying of all these diseases.
On January 26, 1909, the New York Press published a report by W.B. Clark which stated, "Cancer was practically unknown until cowpox vaccination began to be introduced. I have seen 200 cases of cancer, and I never saw a case of cancer in an unvaccinated person." Then, in 1913, the American Cancer Society was founded by none other than John D. Rockefeller, whose own scientists at the Rockefeller Institute had already discovered the live virus cancer connection long before this date. Since then, the number of vaccinations given to children has skyrocketed. In fact, from birth, children are now recommended to receive 16 vaccinations in 69 doses. That's a whole lot of poison. Not surprisingly, cancer rates across the country have also skyrocketed. More recent studies predict that 1 in 3 children born after the year 2000 will develop some form of cancer before the age of 18. Lung specialist Wolfgang Wodarg holds political office as chairman of the Health Committee in the German Parliament and European Council. He has said that there are many risks associated with the vaccine for the H1N1 virus. According to Dr. Wodarg, the swine flu vaccine contains cancerous cells from animals, and there is no data indicating whether or not this may cause an allergic reaction when injected into humans. Some fear that the risk of cancer could be increased by injecting the cells. It also raises questions about the risk of contracting cancer from these injections. He also told the German press that the widespread fear of the pandemic was an orchestration, stating, "It is great business for the pharmaceutical industry. Swine flu is not very different from the normal flu. On the contrary, if you look at the number of cases, it is nothing compared to a normal flu outbreak." Top cancer research specialist Dr. Bernice Eddy warned the U.S. Congress in 1972 that if the polio vaccine containing the deadly virus SV40 was not withdrawn from general use, there would be an epidemic of cancer and related deaths in the millions 20 years later. She was ignored and penalized for stating this, losing all funding for her research. Of course, as predicted, the figures show not only the outbreak of HIV/AIDS, which has claimed millions of lives, but also of the cancer death epidemic that she spoke of. Many claims have been made detailing the controversy surrounding SV40 research. Many investigative journalists indicate that researchers were penalized for reporting the findings of a potential cause and effect relationship between the early polio vaccine, SV40, and cancer, and further allege falsification of research due to financial conflicts of interest at pharmaceutical companies. An analysis presented at the Vaccine Cell Substrate Conference in 2004 suggested that vaccines used in the former Soviet bloc countries, China, Japan, and Africa, could have been contaminated up until 1980, meaning that hundreds of millions more people could have knowingly been exposed to these viruses. Of course, all the world ever saw through newspapers, radio, and a new fad called television, even back then, was this.
These are the proud hills of the state of Virginia in the springtime of 1956. Springtime, beckoning to a small boy, urging him to wander with the wind, to the farm perhaps, over the pasture fence to catch a calf. Not an easy thing, because after all, a calf's a youngster like himself. Ride him? Sure. Well, what's a day without a little rough and tumble? When a boy needs comfort, there's always home and mother and father. This is the world of Randy Kerr of Oakton, Virginia. Typical, except for one thing. Randy was the first child to receive an injection of Salk polio vaccine in the field trials in 1954. Much, however, had preceded this moment when Randy Kerr made history. In 1954, a vaccine to prevent paralytic polio, developed by Dr. Jonas Salk, a grantee of the National Foundation, was tested in the largest field trials in medical history. Finally, April 12, 1955, Salk vaccine safe, effective. The next challenge, commercial production of the polio vaccine in quantity. A huge task, a complex process, all detailed in this book. It's officially called a protocol. Here, the manufacturer records every step in the production of one lot of vaccine. Vital to the production of the vaccine are monkeys from the Far East, given the best of care. Meanwhile, another basic ingredient of the polio vaccine is being prepared, a rich, nourishing liquid called Medium 199. Some 68 different elements go into Medium 199. Each is carefully checked, weighed, and combined according to the formula. And when all is thoroughly blended, the medium is tested for absolute sterility. Why this elaborate preparation? Into Medium 199 will go monkey kidney tissue, first carefully minced by hand. In these bottles, the monkey kidney tissue grows, getting its nourishment from the rich Medium 199. For 6 days, the bottles rock and the tissue grows. Then, because all the nourishment in the medium is exhausted, half is siphoned off to be replaced by fresh medium, but with a difference. The difference, a big one, is that here, for the first time, live polio virus is planted in the medium. 3 different strains of polio virus are added. The completed vaccine will protect against all 3 types of paralytic polio. And once more, the bottles rock. In 4 days, the virus, so minute yet so lethal, multiplies 250 to 1,000 times. Another stage in the complex production of vaccine has been reached. The poliovirus solution is ready for harvesting. Next, filtration, a vitally important process. First, the virus solution goes through these metal tubes containing porcelain filters. Then through sheets of asbestos to strain out all kidney tissue and remove any stray bacteria. More tests. Rabbits are inoculated to make sure that no B virus, a dangerous but non-polio virus, is in the solutions. Guinea pigs, too, receive injections to make certain that the solutions are free of tuberculosis bacilli. Finally, the climax of production, inactivation. The power of the poliovirus to infect man will be utterly destroyed. The colorless, pungent chemical formaldehyde will deal the deadly blow to the poliovirus. For 66 hours, in a warm incubator room, the inactivation process continues. Then what remains can only do good, provide humans with protection from paralytic polio. A chapter ends. The enemy of man is now ready to become his servant. At every step of the way, checks and double checks. This technician is working on a tissue culture safety test. Double check on the complete inactivation of the virus. 4 such tissue culture tests are conducted on every batch of vaccine. These are the bottles which finally will find their way to doctors' offices and clinics all over the country. Once the Public Health Service authorizes its release, the polio vaccine can begin to protect American youngsters. In 1955, over 10 million children received 1 or more injections of Salk vaccine. For maximum protection from paralytic polio, 3 inoculations. The second given not less than 2 weeks after the first. The third not less than 7 months later. Your child or any member of your family eligible for polio vaccine in your community should be vaccinated now. Vaccination now will save lives from death or paralysis this year. Make use of increasing supplies of vaccine. Help your child grow up strong and straight, free from crippling polio.
So what's in a vaccine anyway? Well, we start with chicken embryos. We then generally add live virus for which we're creating the vaccine for, though sometimes we use a dead one. Next, we add a touch of formaldehyde. You know, like embalming fluid. Like the dead frog juice from biology class. Next, to make sure everything's kosher in there, we add a few antibiotics, because who knows what's swimming around in there. And while we're at it, we add some ether, a little bit of detergent. This is only a little more potent than your typical laundry detergent. And then finally, we get to the good stuff. Adjuvants and preservatives, generally mercury in the form of thimerosal, squalene, aluminium salts, aluminum phosphate and aluminum hydroxide, and other heavy metals and preservatives. So let's talk about what these adjuvants and preservatives really are. What is an adjuvant? The word adjuvant comes from the Latin word adjuvere, meaning to help or to aid. In immunology, an adjuvant is an agent that may stimulate the immune system and increase a response to a vaccine, without having any specific antigenic effect in itself. An immunologic adjuvant is defined as any substance that acts to accelerate, prolong, or enhance antigen-specific immune responses when used in combination with specific vaccine antigens. In the scientific community, adjuvants have whimsically been called the dirty little secret of vaccines. This dates from the early days of commercial vaccine manufacture, when significant variations in the effectiveness of different batches of the same vaccine were observed, correctly assumed to be due to the contamination of the reaction vessels, or humans. However, it was soon found that more scrupulous attention to cleanliness actually seemed to reduce the effectiveness of vaccines, and that the contaminants, or dirt, actually enhanced the immune response. There are many known adjuvants in widespread use today, including oils, aluminum salts, and virisomes, although precisely how they work is still not entirely understood. Adjuvants in immunology are often used to modify or augment the effects of a vaccine by stimulating the immune system to respond to the vaccine more vigorously, and thus providing increased immunity to a particular disease. Because immune systems have evolved to recognize these specific antigenics, the presence of an adjuvant in conjunction with the vaccine can greatly increase the innate immune response to the antigen by augmenting the activities of the dendritic cells, DCs, lymphocytes, and macrophages by mimicking a natural infection. Now, this is the scientific explanation, but let's look at what these adjuvants really do to the human body. First, let's take a look at squalene, the most notorious of these adjuvants. Micropaleontologist Dr. Vieira Scheibner conducted research into the adverse effects of adjuvants in vaccines and wrote, "Squalene contributed to the cascade of reactions called Gulf War syndrome. GIs developed arthritis, fibromyalgia, lymphadenopathy, rashes and photosensitive rashes, malar rashes, chronic fatigue, chronic headaches, abnormal body hair loss, non-healing skin lesions, aphthous ulcers, dizziness, weakness, memory loss, seizures, mood changes, neuropsychiatric problems, antithyroid effects, anemia, elevated erythrocyte sedimentation rate, or ESR, systematic lupus erythematosus, multiple sclerosis, deadly amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Raynaud's phenomenon with paroxysms of lack of blood in fingers and toes, Sjögren's syndrome with blurred vision, chronic diarrhea, night sweats, and low-grade fever. The anthrax vaccines I had in the military damaged my health. I live in a world of chronic pain and numerous other problems. Thousands of veterans have died from the vaccine, and hundreds of thousands are crippled. Please do not take these vaccines. You do not want to go from being healthy to being chronically ill. It is a nightmare. This was taken from a website forum where veterans were discussing vaccines. Author unknown. A study linking squalene, an experimental vaccine adjuvant, to individuals with the clinical signs of Gulf War syndrome was published in 2002. A U.S. federal judge ruled that there was good cause to believe squalene to be harmful, and he ordered the Pentagon to stop administering it in October of 2004. Immunologist Dr. Pamela Asa first recognized autoimmune diseases showing up in GIs that mirrored those in lab animals injected with oil-formulated squalene adjuvants. Gary Matsumoto is a New York-based award-winning investigative journalist. His 2004 book, Vaccine A, The Covert Government Experiment That's Killing Our Soldiers and Why GIs Are Only the First Victims, took sharp issue with IOM results and the Pentagon's denial of Gulf War syndrome. According to Matsumoto, today, squalene adjuvants are a key ingredient in a whole new generation of vaccines intended for mass immunization around the globe. Squalene is not just a molecule found in a knee or elbow, it is found throughout the nervous system and the brain. When injected in the body, the immune system attacks it as an enemy to be eliminated. Eating and digesting squalene isn't a problem, but injecting it galvanizes the immune system into attacking it, which can produce self-destructive cross-reactions against the same molecule in the places where it occurs naturally in the body, and where it is critical to the health of the nervous system. Once this systematic self-destruction sequence is induced in the body, it doesn't ever stop. The body continues to naturally make the molecule that the immune system is now trained to attack and destroy. Matsumoto says, squalene is kind of a trigger for a real biological weapon, what Soviet researchers called a biological time bomb. He and Dr. Pam Asa conclude that oil adjuvants are the most insidious chemical weapon ever devised, including ones with squalene. So what American scientists conceived as a vaccine booster, or what's now being developed in labs, was another nano bomb, instigating chronic, unpredictable, and debilitating disease. Using squalene in vaccines is outlandish and criminal. Investigating the shadowy vaccination development world, he discovered U.S. military-employed doctors and scientists conducted secret medical experiments on U.S. citizens in violation of the Nuremberg Code and fundamental medical ethics. According to Matsumoto, by injecting soldiers, the Pentagon violated these and other standards, betrayed the troops, as well as the fundamental duty of military and civilian leaders to protect them. Since at least 1987, biowarfare development trumped the welfare of tens of thousands of GIs used as human guinea pigs for inoculation with experimental, unlicensed anthrax vaccines containing squalene, administered involuntarily without disclosure of its harmful effects to human health. Matsumoto also wrote, "The unethical experiments detailed in this book are ongoing, with little prospect of being self-limiting because they have been shielded from scrutiny and public accountability by national security concerns. Other research shows that squalene is the experimental anthrax vaccine ingredient that caused devastating autoimmune diseases and deaths for many Gulf War veterans from the US, UK, and Australia. Yet it continues to be used today and implemented in new vaccine development in most pharmaceutical labs. There are now data in more than 24 peer-reviewed scientific papers from 10 different laboratories in the US, Europe, Asia, and Australia documenting that squalene-based adjuvants can induce autoimmune diseases in animals, observed in mice, rats, guinea pigs, and rabbits. Matsumoto's book includes numerous case studies of GIs afflicted with one or more of the above syndromes, their devastating effects, and the outlandish U.S. government reaction, completely failing to acknowledge their existence or a connection between them and the administered vaccines, while also denying the effects of other toxic Gulf theater exposures like depleted uranium, as well as withholding meaningful treatments or protocols. So why does Washington continue to sanction its use? According to Matsumoto, scientists in the United States are now literally invested in squalene. Disturbingly, many of the cutting-edge vaccines currently in development by the NIH, or National Institute of Health, and its corporate partners contain squalene in one formation or another. There is squalene in the prototype recombinant vaccines for HIV, malaria, herpes, influenza, including the swine flu strain, cytomegalovirus, and human papillomavirus. Some of these are intended for mass immunizations around the globe, and that possibility should terrify anyone enough to refuse any mandate or doctor's prescription to take them. So, are you angry yet? You should be. But if you're not, let's talk about the greatest political weapon ever conceived: children. Thimerosal is a type of preservative used in vaccines which is made from deadly mercury. A study published in the Toxicological and Environmental Chemistry Journal in June of 2009 showed that the mercury-based compound used as a vaccine preservative, known as thimerosal, induces neural damage similar to that seen in autism patients. According to the study, thimerosal-induced cellular damage led to concentration and time-dependent mitochondrial damage, reduced oxidative reduction activity, cellular degeneration, and cell death. Put simply, this describes autism.
In 1997, a team of research scientists demonstrated that mercury vapor inhalation by animals produced a molecular lesion in brain protein metabolism, which was similar to a lesion seen in 80% of Alzheimer's diseased brains. Recently completed experiments by scientists at the University of Calgary's Faculty of Medicine now reveal, with direct visual evidence from brain neuron tissue cultures, how mercury ions actually alter the cell membrane structure of developing neurons. To better understand mercury's effect on the brain, let us first illustrate what brain neurons look like and how they grow. In this animation, we see 3 brain neurons growing in a tissue culture, each with a central cell body and numerous neurite processes. At the end of each neurite is a growth cone where structural proteins are assembled to form the cell membrane. 2 principal proteins involved in growth cone function are actin, which is responsible for the pulsating motion seen here, and tubulin, a major structural component of the neurite membrane. During normal cell growth, tubulin molecules link together end to end to form microtubules, which surround neurofibrils, another structural protein component of the neuronal axon. Shown here is the neurite of a live neuron isolated from snail brain tissue, displaying linear growth due to growth cone activity. It is important to note that growth cones in all animal species, ranging from snails to humans, have identical structural and behavioral characteristics and use proteins of virtually identical composition. In this experiment, neurons also isolated from snail brain tissue were grown in culture for several days, after which very low concentrations of mercury were added to the culture medium for 20 minutes. Over the next 30 minutes, the neurite membrane underwent rapid degeneration, leaving behind the denuded neurofibrils seen here. In contrast, other heavy metals added at this same concentration, such as aluminum, lead, cadmium, and manganese, did not produce this effect. To understand how mercury causes this degeneration, let us return to our illustration. As mentioned before, tubulin proteins link together during normal cell growth to form the microtubules which support the neurite structure. When mercury ions are introduced into the culture medium, they infiltrate the cell and bind themselves to newly synthesized tubulin molecules. More specifically, the mercury ions attach themselves to the binding site reserved for guanosine triphosphate, or GTP, on the beta subunit of the affected tubulin molecules. Since bound GTP normally provides the energy which allows tubulin molecules to attach to one another, mercury ions bound to these sites prevent tubulin proteins from linking together. Consequently, the neurite's microtubules begin to disassemble into free tubulin molecules, leaving the neurite stripped of its supporting structure. Ultimately, both the developing neurite and its growth cone collapse, and some denuded neurofibrils form aggregates or tangles, as depicted here. Shown here is a neurite growth cone stained specifically for tubulin and actin, before and after mercury exposure. Note that the mercury has caused disintegration of tubulin microtubule structure. These new findings reveal important visual evidence as to how mercury causes neurodegeneration. More importantly, this study provides the first direct evidence that low-level mercury exposure is indeed a precipitating factor that can initiate this neurodegenerative process within the brain.
For a number of years, the statistically accepted rate of autism was about 1 in 150. However, some of the most recent statistics suggest that autism rates in the United States have now conservatively increased to 1 in 63. This was the shocking conclusion from the 2007 survey results from the National Survey of Children's Health, NSCH, which reveals a 100% increase in parent-reported cases of autism spectrum disorders, ASD, compared to their 2003 survey. That's a 100% increase in 4 years. A similar British study puts the current UK autism rate at 1 in 83 children. The vaccine for human papillomavirus, or HPV, is for preventing cervical cancer. In a move that was bold even for big pharmaceutical companies and the CDC, vaccine advocates are now recommending that boys receive the HPV vaccine as well, even though they don't have a cervix. That adds approximately 100% more possible patients to the HPV vaccine recipient roster. Does someone smell profits? A new study has shown that giving hepatitis B vaccine to newborn baby boys more than triples their risk of developing an autism spectrum disorder. The study's authors used U.S. probability samples obtained from National Health Interview Survey, NHIS, from 1997 through 2002 datasets. The conclusion states, findings suggest that U.S. male neonates vaccinated with hepatitis B vaccine had a 3-fold greater risk of ASD. The authors also noted that an earlier study by them found that hepatitis B vaccination was associated with receipt of early intervention and special education services. The new study used a different database than their earlier study, and they found the same results, suggesting a validation of their findings. Routine use of the hepatitis B vaccine for all newborns began in 1992, despite the fact that there was absolutely no logical argument for this vaccination. Do newborn babies really need the hepatitis B vaccine? Well, hepatitis B is about as difficult to catch as HIV/AIDS. Namely, You nearly always need to have blood or sexual contact of some sort to contract it. So why the rush to vaccinate at the most susceptible of developmental stages, years before sex is even a fleeting thought, let alone a possibility for children? And as for blood, aren't transfusions screened for such diseases? Doesn't this just sound like another case of pharmaceutical companies putting profits over ours and our families' health? One recent study found that children who received the hepatitis B vaccine were 50% more likely to develop central nervous system inflammatory demyelination than children who did not receive the vaccine. GlaxoSmithKline's Enerex-B brand of the hepatitis vaccine was shown to be the worst of the bunch, increasing the risk of demyelination by 74%. It also nearly tripled the risk of developing multiple sclerosis in genetically susceptible people. Deceivingly, Enerex-B was licensed and heavily advertised as a thimerosal mercury-free version of the vaccine starting in January of 2007. However, all formulations contain approximately 0.5 milligrams of aluminum per milliliter of vaccine in its place, which studies show may be even worse than mercury when considering its link with Alzheimer's and other neurological disorders. And this would also rationally explain the newly unexplained occurrences of early-onset Alzheimer's disease appearing in teenagers in the last few years. So the real question on everyone's mind is mandatory vaccination possible? To answer this question, let's look at the government's own legislation. In 1946, the U.S. Public Health Service was established and Executive Order 9708 was signed, listing the communicable diseases where quarantines can be used. In 1946 and 2003, cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, typhoid, smallpox, yellow fever, and viral hemorrhagic fevers were added to the list. On April 4, 2003, Executive Order 13295 added SARS to the forced vaccination list. Then, on April 1, 2005, Executive Order 13295 added influenza caused by novel or re-emergent influenza viruses that are causing or have the potential to cause a pandemic. The President gave the Secretary of Health and Human Services the power to quarantine at his or her discretion. The Secretary of Health and Human Services now has the power to arrange for the apprehension and examination of persons reasonably thought to be infected. A cough or a fever could put a person at risk for being quarantined for an extended period of time without recourse. On January 28, 2003, Project BioShield was introduced during Bush's State of the Union address. This created permanent and indefinite funding authority to develop medical countermeasures. The National Institutes of Health was given the authority to speed approval of drugs and vaccines. Emergency approval of fast-tracked drugs and vaccines can now be given without the regular course of safety testing. On December 17, 2006, Division E, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, was created. This was added as an addendum to the Defense Appropriations Bill, H.R. 2863, at 11:20 p.m. on a Saturday night, long after House committee members had signed off on the bill and gone home for the holidays. Under Section B, Paragraph 1, it states, "The Secretary of Health and Human Services can make a determination that a disease, health condition, or threat constitutes a public health emergency. He or she may then recommend the manufacture, testing, development, administration, or use of one or more covered countermeasures." A covered countermeasure is defined as a pandemic product, vaccine, or drug. This act also provides complete liability protection for all drugs, vaccines, or biological products deemed a covered countermeasure and used for an outbreak of any kind. Complete liability protection has been given to drug companies for any product used for any public health emergency declared by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Pharmaceutical corporations are now protected from all accountability unless criminal intent to do harm can be proven by the injured party. They are protected from liability even if they know the drug will be harmful to your health. You, however, have no protection or recourse at all from a government who stands to profit from forced mandatory vaccination.
If we've asked for U.S. attorneys' opinions, is it illegal to create a recreated, weaponized 1918 virus? Is what Taubenberger's team doing, is it illegal? They always respond, no, under the guidelines of the U.S. Department of Defense, it's not illegal at all. They have the rights and the abilities to do that. And it's not illegal to create a vaccine to fight against it. Just look at what happened in anthrax during the Gulf War. We supplied the anthrax to Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and so when we go in there, we have to get vaccines for all of our soldiers to protect against the weapon that we created for them. Okay, so it's not illegal to do all that. In fact, the military wants those vaccines to have in stockpile, so that's not illegal.
Now, shockingly, this isn't the only time that we can see in the U.S. Code where the government feels it has the right to poison, irradiate, and use humans as test subjects. Let's take a look at some of these in the U.S. Code. Let's look at Title 50, Chapter 32. Listed as the Chemical and Biological Warfare Program, we go to Section 1520A, where the government lists restrictions on use of human subjects for testing of chemical or biological agents. Part A reads Prohibited Activities. The Secretary of Defense may not conduct, directly or by contract, 1. Any test or experiment involving the use of a chemical agent or biological agent on a civilian population, or 2. Any other testing of a chemical agent or biological agent on human subjects. Well, that certainly sounds like a good thing until we read Part B. Under exceptions, it states, subject to subsections C, D, and E of this section, the prohibition in subsection A of this section does not apply to a test or experiment carried out for any of the following purposes. 1. Any peaceful purpose that is related to a medical, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, agricultural, industrial, or research activity. Remember, we're talking about humans like you and me here. 2. Any purpose that is directly related to protection against toxic chemicals or biological weapons and agents. And 3. Any law enforcement purpose, including any purpose related to riot control. Under Part C, it states, informed consent required, and this is very important. The Secretary of Defense may conduct a test or experiment described in subsection B of this section only if informed consent to the testing was obtained from each human subject in advance of the testing on that subject. Now, it is important to note here that your consent is always assumed in all of these experiments. The only way to protest this type of treatment, irradiation, and chemical exposure by your government is to verbally and in writing not consent. Again, consent is always assumed. And because you are fooled into voting for representatives, your consent is granted by Congress. Under Part D, prior notice to Congress, not later than 30 days after the date of final approval within the Department of Defense of plans for any experiment to study or be conducted by the Department of Defense, whether directly or under contract, involving the use of human subjects for the testing of a chemical agent or biological agent, the Secretary of Defense shall submit to the Committee on Armed Services of the Senate and the Committee on Armed Services of the House of Representatives a report stating forth a full accounting of those plans, and the experiment or study may then be conducted only after the end of the 30-day period, beginning on the date such report is received by those committees. Again, your consent to be tested on is being granted by your congressmen and your senators, and generally with the full knowledge and comprehension of the governor of your state. In Part E, the U.S. Code actually defines what a biological agent is. In this section, the term biological agent means any microorganism, including bacteria, viruses like the flu virus, fungi, rickettsia, or protozoa, pathogen or infectious substance, and any naturally occurring bioengineered or synthesized component of any such microorganism, pathogen or infectious substance, whatever its origin or method of production, like the re-engineered, recombined flu virus, that is capable of causing death, disease, or other biological malfunction in a human, an animal, a plant, or another living organism. Deterioration of food, water, equipment, supplies, or materials of any kind, or deleterious alteration of the environment. So the government just gave its permission to kill, disease, or make to malfunction the human, animal, plant, or other living organism's body. They've given their permission to deteriorate our food, water, equipment, supplies, and materials of any kind, and they've given their permission to alter our environment. This is your government. And these are the same people who want to vaccinate you, and passing laws to force vaccinate you and your children. Under Section 1519, labeled Lethal Binary Chemical Munitions, and under Paragraph A, it states, notwithstanding any other provision of law, none of the funds authorized to be appropriated by this or any other act shall be used for the purpose of production of lethal binary chemical munitions, unless the President certifies to Congress that the production of such munitions is essential to the national interest, and submits a full report thereon to the President of the Senate, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives as far in advance of the production of such munitions as is practicable. And what is the definition of lethal binary chemical munitions? Simply, they are 1. Any toxic chemical, solid, liquid, or gas, which, through its chemical properties, is intended to be used to produce injury or death to human beings. Or 2. Any unique device, instrument, apparatus, or contrivance, including any components or accessories thereof, intended to be used to disperse or otherwise disseminate any such toxic chemical. Again, your government is allowing itself to harm you with any toxic chemical, solid, liquid, or gas, dispersed from any device, instrument, apparatus, etc. And these are the people that we are hoping are protecting us from vaccination, injury, infection, and death. Moving on to Section 1515, listed as suspension and presidential authorization, we read that after November 19, 1969, the operation of this chapter or any portion thereof may be suspended by the President during the period of any war declared by Congress and during the period of any national emergency declared by Congress or by the President. Note here that a national emergency was certainly declared for the so-called swine flu outbreak of 2009, and that state of emergency has not, to this date, been relieved. Under Section 1516, titled Delivery Systems, it states that none of the funds authorized to be appropriated by this Act shall be used for the procurement of delivery systems specifically designed to disseminate lethal chemical or any biological warfare agents, or for the procurement of delivery system parts or components specifically designed for such purpose, unless the President shall certify to the Congress that such procurement is essential to the safety and security of the United States. Under Section 1512, titled Transportation, Open-Air Testing, and Disposal, Presidential Determination Report to Congress, Notice to Congress and State Governors, it states that none of the funds authorized to be appropriated by this Act or any other act may be used for the transportation of any lethal chemical or any biological warfare agent to or from any military installation in the United States, or the open-air testing of any such agent within the United States, or the disposal of any such agent within the United States, until the following procedures have been implemented. 1. The Secretary of Defense has determined that the transportation or testing proposed to be made is necessary in the interests of national security. 2. The Secretary has brought the particulars of the proposed transportation, testing, or disposal to the attention of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who in turn may direct the Surgeon General of the Public Health Service and other qualified persons to review such particulars with respect to any hazards to public health and safety which such transportation, testing, or disposal may pose, and to recommend what precautionary measures are necessary to protect the public health and safety. And 3. The Secretary has implemented any precautionary measures recommended in accordance with paragraph 2 above, including, where practical, detoxification of any such agent, if such agent is to be transported to or from a military installation for disposal, provided, however, that in the event the Secretary finds the recommendations submitted by the Surgeon General would have the effect of preventing the proposed transportation, testing, or disposal, the President may determine that overriding considerations of national security require such transportation, testing, or disposal be conducted. Any transportation, testing, or disposal conducted pursuant to such presidential determination shall be carried out in the safest practicable manner, and the President shall report his determination and an explanation thereof to the President of the Senate, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives as far in advance as practicable. And 4. The Secretary has provided notification that the transportation, testing, or disposal will take place, except where a presidential determination has been made, a. to the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives at least 10 days before any such transportation will be commenced, and at least 30 days before any such testing or disposal will be commenced. And b. to the Governor of any state through which such agents will be transported, such notification to be provided appropriately in advance of any such transportation. And then there's Title 18, Part 1. Under Chapter 113B, we come to terrorism. Under Section 2332H, titled Radiological Dispersal Devices, we find out that the government can in fact irradiate us any time it wants to. Under Paragraph A, Section 1, it states that in general, except as provided in Paragraph 2, it shall be unlawful for any person to knowingly produce, construct, otherwise acquire, transfer, directly or indirectly, receive, possess, import, export, or use, or possess and threaten to use, a. any weapon that is designed or intended to release radiation or radioactivity at a level dangerous to human life, or b. any device or other object that is capable of or designed or intended to endanger human life through the release of radiation or radioactivity. Once again, that sounds fantastic. But in Part 2, it states, exception. This subsection does not apply with respect to A. Conduct by or under the authority of the United States or any department or agency thereof, or conduct pursuant to the terms of a contract with the United States or any department or agency thereof. One example of this would be the Department of Transportation and the Department of Homeland Security now using full-body radiation scanners in airports, requiring you to pass through these DNA-destroying machines, which provably cause cancer, with the full protection of the U.S. government under Title 18. Again, the public has no recourse against this type of action taken by your supposedly representative government, especially under a national emergency. Now, to be perfectly clear, the United States federal government has given itself permission to commit terrorist acts upon not only the American people, but against the entirety of the population of this planet, human, animal, and other. It is also giving its permission to any person, entity, or private or public corporation to use what the U.S. Code defines as terrorism through their purposeful release of radiation or of radiological materials under government contract. To be clear, this is legalized terrorism. Do you understand? The U.S. government is legally a self-proclaimed terrorist by its own law of admission in Title 18 of the U.S. Code. This is your America. Now, Thomas Jefferson, the main author of the Constitution of the United States, obviously foresaw this absolute corruption of power, as is evidenced in many of his personal writings and journals. But one of those quotes in particular is surely the most apparent and appropriate foreshadowing of our current government. As Jefferson so eloquently stated, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government. And, perhaps equally as self-evident in its ideal, he stated, "The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny in government." If what you have seen in this presentation does not, in your mind, qualify as tyranny against the people of the United States, or as wholeheartedly destructive to life, liberty, and to the pursuit of our happiness, or somehow does not qualify as a legitimate right of the people to abolish and institute a new government, then there is one other quote that applies to this situation and to yourself. Anyone who trades liberty for security deserves neither liberty or security. Can you still possibly believe that your government is there to protect you from vaccination harm? Well, perhaps the preceding information was just not enough, for some reason, to make you change your mind about vaccination. Well, then there's nothing that I can do, except to cover the one aspect of vaccine production and usage that we have not covered thus far. The moral and ethical implication of vaccine production must be considered to fully comprehend the devilish nature of this for-profit business called the pharmaceutical industry, and the government who supposedly regulates that industry.
I'm wondering, first of all, how are we coming in developing a cell-based vaccine rather than the traditional egg-based vaccine that we're still using for development of the H1N1 vaccine?
Well, investing in developing a faster, newer technology is still very much underway. It's part of what we're doing on an ongoing basis. So we're trying to accelerate the work, but it's not imminent that we will have another methodology for developing a vaccine than the egg-based methodology.
I think you can expect more hearings on this topic, and we're going to also ask some of the experts from NIH.
I was going to say I would welcome the scientists.
I mean,
When the Congresswoman here refers to cell-based cultures for vaccine production, she is actually referring to what is called human diploid cells. You see, it is much easier on her conscience and much easier for the public to remain happily ignorant of what cell-based vaccine production really is by referring to it in this way. But the real nature of cell-based vaccine production is quite simply the legal and unethical growth of vaccine culture on human aborted fetus material. These aborted fetus cells are harvested at the time of abortion and kept frozen for future vaccine production and cloning. Renee Leva, medical doctor, published an essay called A Brief History of Human Diploid Cell Strains. She wrote, "The Pontifical Academy for Life published a response about the moral legitimacy of immunizing children with vaccines manufactured using cell strains derived from aborted human fetuses. In order to fully appreciate the level of cooperation involved among different agents, it is important to review the history of the development of these cell strains. The need to articulate the moral reflection on the matter in question arises mainly from the connection which exists between the vaccines mentioned above and the procured abortions from which biological material necessary for their preparation was obtained. Human diploid cell strains are batches of cells that are currently used for different purposes, including culturing viruses for the manufacturing of vaccines. Human diploid cell strain-derived human vaccines have been licensed worldwide for polio vaccines, rabies, rubella, measles, varicella, mumps, and hepatitis A. Current vaccines contain extremely small traces of the original fetal DNA, while the cell strains themselves contain the complete fetal chromosomal set." She goes on to state that at this point, it is important to mention that pharmaceutical companies in both Europe and North America quickly became involved in the use of human diploid cell strains. The World Health Organization, in joint effort with the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, funded meetings and training sessions with individuals interested in learning about human diploid cell strains during the 1960s. The question has been posed whether this is like benefiting from the use of an organ from an executed person or from unethical Nazi research. Dr. Norby described how these cell strains were harvested. He stated that when we collected the organs, this was done immediately after the legal abortion. We were on duty to immediately perform the sampling and to arrange for an as rapid transport as possible over the Atlantic Ocean. The fetal material arrived by car from the nearby hospital to our laboratory and wrapped in a green surgical cloth. Maximum sterility was critical to allow the outgrowth of fetal cells within any contamination after the transport under cold conditions to the Wistar Institute. He goes on to state that at the time in the early 1960s when organs from aborted fetuses were collected and sent to the Wistar Institute, no one, as of yet, had invented the concept of informed consent. I am absolutely convinced that there is no remaining documentation about the fetuses used from the Department of Virus Research of the Karolinska Institute at the time. I was the head of the department between 1972 and 1997. Thus, in case there is no documentation that allows identification of fetal samples at the Worcester Institute, there is no way of tracing them. I do, in fact, remember the time well, because we, as graduate students, made the dissections collecting organs. Even though there are many cell strains in use in research, the most well-known are WI38 and MRC-5. These two cell strains come from two deliberately aborted fetuses. But as the evidence shows, there were more abortions involved to achieve the technical expertise needed for development of these cell strains. In addition, other cell strains have been developed for vaccine manufacturing and other purposes. The Worcester Institute is a scientific institute located on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, specializing in the fields of immunology and cell biology. Working for the institute in 1961, Dr. Leonard Hayflick first published a paper describing 25 human diploid cell strains, WI1 through WI25. WI meaning Worcester Institute fetal samples, number 1 through 25. These cell strains were derived from the lung, skin, muscle, kidney, heart, thyroid, thymus, and liver of 19 separate, electively aborted fetuses. The purpose of choosing different organs was to test difference in tissue characteristics. His research included also testing these cell strains' susceptibility for different viruses. Now, importantly, abortion was illegal in the United States at that time. So fetal tissue, the abortions, were provided by Dr. Sven Gard of the Karolinska Institute Medical School in Stockholm, Sweden. Dr. Erling Norby, who later served as chairman of the Department of Virology and dean of the medical facility at the Karolinska Institute, was a graduate student there during this period. He dissected many of the aborted fetuses. My predecessor, a professor of virology at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sven Gard, spent a sabbatical year at the Worcester Institute in 1959. One of my duties as a young student in the laboratory in Stockholm was to dissect human fetuses from legal abortions and send organs to the Worcester Institute in America. Such material was the source of many important studies of cell lines at the Institute. An article co-authored by Gard and his colleagues at the Worcester Institute stated, "A human diploid cell strain derived from a fetal lung tissue was employed instead of monkey kidney cells for the preparation of the attenuated poliovirus vaccine utilized in our study. For the past 35 years, many of the common human virus vaccines, such as measles, rubella, hepatitis A, rabies, and poliovirus, have been produced in cells derived from a human fetus to the benefit of tens of millions of Americans. Thus, precedent has been established for the use of fetal tissue that would otherwise be discarded." Under the origin of rubella virus RA27-3, it states that currently that virus strain found in the rubella vaccine most commonly used around the world was developed by Dr. Stanley Plotkin and colleagues at the Worcester Institute. The RA27-3, meaning rubella abortus 27th fetus, third tissue extract, virus strain was obtained from a female human fetus in a series of 27 abortions in the United States. Explant cultures were made of the dissected organs of a particular fetus aborted because of rubella, the 27th in our series of fetuses aborted during the 1964 epidemic. The fetus was from a 25-year-old mother exposed to rubella 8 weeks after her last menstrual period. The fetus was surgically aborted 7 days after maternal illness and dissected immediately. It was then grown on Worcester Institute, or WI-38. We can also go to the World Health Organization's website under the Rabies section, where it lists its information on human vaccines using human diploid cells. Here it states, "As regards vaccines for human use, Around 1955, there was a transition from vaccines prepared from animal nerve tissue to embryonated eggs, and very soon afterwards, around 1960, to adaptation of rabies virus to cultures of human diploid cells. Under the section titled Vaccine for Humans Prepared in Human Diploid Cells, it states, an inactivated rabies vaccine for human use was first prepared in cell culture in 1964. In 1966, it was shown that the human diploid cell, or HDC strain, Wistar Institute, or WI-38, was a suitable substrate for the propagation of the Pittman-Moore strain of fixed rabies virus. That vaccine was first licensed for use in France in 1974, and commercial production started in 1978. Further evidence of these aborted fetuses used as cell substrates in the growth of vaccine cultures can be found in the very inserts that come within the vaccine product. Here we see the product insert for the measles, mumps, and rubella live virus vaccine. This vaccine comes from Merck and Company, and is one of the most widely used and recommended vaccines for both children and adults. The MMR2 live virus vaccine is a combination of 3 vaccines. Part 1 is Attenuvax, the live virus measles vaccine, which is propagated in a chicken embryo cell culture. Part 2 of the vaccine is MumpsVac, the live virus mumps vaccine, and it too is propagated in chick embryo cell cultures. But Part 3 is called Merovax-2, the live virus rubella vaccine, and it includes the Wistar RA27-3 strain of the live attenuated rubella virus propagated in Wistar Institute-38 human diploid lung fibroblasts. And here's the insert for the inactivated poliomyelitis vaccine with a diploid cell origin. It states that inactivated poliomyelitis vaccine is a highly purified inactivated poliovirus vaccine produced by microcarrier culture. The viruses are grown in cultures of MRC-5 cells, a line of normal human diploid cells, by the microcarrier technique. The cells are grown in CMRL 1969 medium supplemented with calf serum. Finally, here's the insert for the Merck Drug Company's Veravax, which is the live virus varicella vaccine. It states that the virus was initially obtained from a child with natural varicella, then introduced into human embryonic lung cell cultures, human diploid cells, adapted to and propagated in embryonic guinea pig cell cultures, and finally propagated in other human diploid cell cultures, Wistar Institute-38. Further passage of the virus for varicella vaccine was performed at Merck Research Laboratories in human diploid cell cultures MRC-5. Now, what's most important for you to understand as a person who has or will possibly receive this and other vaccines using human diploid cells, including your children, is this. Each 0.5 milliliter dose of vaccine contains the following: residual components of MRC-5 cells, including DNA and protein. What does this mean? This means that every time that you, your family, your children receive a vaccine using human diploid cells as the growth medium, you are receiving DNA and protein structures from human aborted babies. They are introduced into your body with the vaccine. You, as a vaccinated person, most likely have human aborted fetus particles floating around in your body. Now, even if this research and the science that it's backed by is not enough to make you stop taking and giving vaccines, the moral and ethical question of how these vaccines are produced, using a very profitable abortion industry and the discarded fetuses that go along with that industry, should make you ill. You know, there's one final thing to consider here about abortions, the abortion industry, and the use of human diploid cells in medical research. Remember that it was in the 1960s that these harvested cell cultures were retrieved from aborted fetuses. But those fetuses came from Stockholm, Sweden. Now, when we consider what happened just a decade later, in the case of Roe versus Wade, we must consider why that landmark case legalized abortion in all 50 states. Importing those aborted fetuses and flying them across the Atlantic Ocean is not at all inexpensive. And yet, if abortion were to be legalized in the United States, the access to aborted fetal material would become as easy and accessible as picking a dandelion. It is this author's opinion that the sole purpose for the Roe versus Wade decision in the Supreme Court was simply to make abortion legal for the purposes of acquiring cheap fetal material. Perhaps the best reason to consider this as true would be to realize that Norma McCorvey, or as we know her, Jane Roe, never even had an abortion. And yet in that Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade, abortion was legalized in all 50 states. Also, prior to that case, abortion was not under the jurisdiction of the federal government, but was actually under the jurisdiction of state law. Although she had been pregnant 3 times, she had never sought an abortion. Her first out-of-wedlock baby was born when she was 17. Miss Roe, Norma McCorvey, allowed her mother to raise that child. Her second child was placed up for adoption, and in March 1970, she was pregnant once more and was recruited by 2 young female lawyers for what eventually became a class-action lawsuit with Norma, or Jane Roe, as the lead plaintiff. Miss McCorvey actually alleges that these lawyers misled her into thinking that she could get an abortion through their intervention. According to Norma, her attorneys coerced her into signing a document that they could use for their own law-changing agenda against the state of Texas. And after leaving the Texas courts and arriving at the Supreme Court, 7 of the 9 justices ruled in favor of Jane Roe on January 22, 1973, thus creating one of the most profitable medical industries in history, the abortion industry, including the sale of aborted babies and their parts. I would submit that this is not a coincidence, nor did it have anything to do with the pro-life or pro-choice movements, which are used so cunningly to divide the voting public.
Thanks to all of you at Planned Parenthood for all the work that you are doing for women all across the country and for families all across the country and for men who have enough sense to realize you're helping them all across the country.
If they make a mistake, I don't want them punished with a baby.
Well, the first thing I'd do as president is sign the Freedom of Choice Act. That's the first thing that I'd do. With one more vacancy on the court, we could be looking at a majority hostile to a woman's fundamental right to choose for the first time since Roe versus Wade, and that is what is at stake in this election. There will always be people, many of goodwill, who do not share my view on the issue of choice. On this fundamental issue, I will not yield, and Planned Parenthood will not yield. Thanks to all of you at Planned Parenthood for all the work that you are doing for women all across the country and for families all across the country and for men who have enough sense to realize you're helping them all across the country. I will not yield, and Planned Parenthood will not yield.
Usually at the end of these kind of movies, there is always a small but hopeful tidbit about solutions to the problems we all face. But I am not going to pretend that there is a peaceful solution here. For there is not. I won't tell you to write your congressman or your senator, for they are the indirect beneficiaries of the legislation that they pass, allowing for vaccination to be fast-tracked and mandatory. And I won't tell you to talk to your doctor, for the healthcare industry is the main beneficiary of the sale and injection of what the pharmaceutical industry pumps out of its dirty factories. And the thought of a cure to any disease is the last thing that these for-profit industries want to see. The truth of the matter is that you and I have no legal recourse for the death and disease that are deliberately being caused by the healthcare, reproductive care, vaccination, and pharmaceutical industries, not to mention the abortion industry. For the legal system is not there to protect the people from the actions of corporations, but instead is there to protect the corporations from the people. The laws of the U.S. Code are quite clear in this regard and have been set in place to specifically protect these corporations from liability. To understand why this has happened and to comprehend the symbiotic relationship between these industries and government, you must understand that government has been investing into the stock of these publicly traded pharmaceutical and healthcare corporations for more than 70 years. Government investments and stock ownership now represent the majority stake holding in these corporations. And so, the government is now regulating these industries and these corporations for which it has collectively majority stock ownership. For more on this conflict of interest, please view my other documentaries, The Corporation Nation Part 1 and The Great Pension Fund Hoax, which are also presented for free to view. In the end, there is but one solution to this madness that we have uncovered here, and that solution is for you, the people, to stop allowing it to happen. You must no longer give your permission to government or your doctor regarding medicines and vaccinations. You must say out loud that you do not consent. For all law is based on the consent of the governed. And as long as you remain silent, this vaccination and combined sterility program will continue through the United Nations and through the participation of governments around the world. And so, only you can stop the destruction of life.